Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're talking with Shelley Craig, Program Director of Faith Grief Ministries. This non-denominational, faith-focused organization based in Dallas, Texas, hosts a wide variety of in-person and virtual gatherings that invite people to share their stories of grief and healing. Welcome, Shelley, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Holly. Thank you so much for having me today at the Remembering a Life podcast.
Let me ask you, how did your Faith and Grief Ministry come to be? Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Holly. Well, we're actually commemorating our 10th anniversary. Faith and Grief started just before that. Two of our three founders were working locally here in Dallas, one at a local hospice and one at a local church. And they were running into similar families because of that in working both in pastoral care and grief work. And they realized that they were trying to find a way to support those families really after the casserole stopped. And so Faith and Grief Ministries first started as a luncheon where folks could come together, tell their stories of their loved ones, and listen to a speaker share their own personal grief journey, and just find community with one another, both in their loss and grief, but also find a place to be able to share their story.
Shelley, talk about what role faith can play in helping us to grieve a loss.
Yes, I think our faith traditions, our beliefs sometimes can frame how we grieve. For a lot of folks, the rituals around end of life, the rituals around loss, help in the comfort and healing. A funeral, for instance, for many families, may be one of the few times everyone gets together. It seems those poignant times of life, births, weddings, and funerals, bring people together. But someone's faith takes it a step further. Whatever their faith tradition, many times the rituals that they experience through their faith and really their connection with what's sacred and holy, whether that's, calling your higher power God or attending regular worship or attending synagogue regularly, those things can help, but sometimes they can also be a challenge. We certainly find that many of us grieving at some point, if we are a person of faith, that we can hit challenges in our faith. Loss is one of those things that can really shake a person's faith as much as sometimes strengthen it.
And you talk about the importance of sharing our stories of grief and healing in relation to our faith. How does that help us on our grief journey?
Well, faith and grief, we find that so many times as someone's grieving, those around them sometimes are not always the best support because they're grieving themselves many times. And so sometimes finding a supportive group or a therapist or a pastor or a rabbi, imam, someone who they can talk to and share their story, someone who may have known their loved one certainly helps. But there's a point in grief, especially in early grief. Early grief so many times is sort of that busy time. It's sort of foggy and people don't remember everything. But there's a point where it gets quiet. And that's usually when people reach out because people stop asking about their loved ones. They stop checking in on them. And it's not anyone's fault. It's people get busy, they get all their lives. And those of us in grief, sometimes we lose connection with people too. And being able to share our stories, talk about our loved ones, say their name, laugh about the funny things that they did or we did together, it's just such a healing way to walk a grief journey.
On your website, you say that grief is both a leveler and a uniter. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. One of the things that I think in modern society, we don't think about death very much. In fact, we spend a lot of time avoiding it in so many ways. In past generations, death was much closer to us. People died at home. Many times there was people died younger. And so grief is something that we all will experience in our lifetime. No one is exempt from this club. We all will experience loss. And talking about leveling it, it's something that we all will experience. Our faith can support us in that grief. Our community can come and uplift us, hold us, support us during that time. And so it can do both.
Is it possible, Shelley, that faith might complicate our grief?
Absolutely. In so many different types of loss, our faith sometimes, whatever the dogma may be from that particular faith tradition, it can complicate the grief, especially in certain types of loss that traditionally faith traditions haven't supported grievers in. And the one that comes to mind is suicide loss. Our faith can also complicate things in the sense that many times those around us will will try and help, but sometimes they'll add phrases, they're in a better place, or, this was God's plan. There's a lot of things that sometimes just can't help. Our faith can be so supportive and can be a true balm in a time of grief and loss, but it sometimes can also hinder our process because it can add layers of guilt and shame that we may not necessarily need as we're grieving.
So then what can we do when that complication happens?
Yeah, I think that's so many times our faith, if it does complicate our grief experience, and sometimes that's around, like I said, sort of the dogma or the historical lessons that have been taught that may not necessarily be of the faith tradition, but maybe from the culture or from what people think might come from the tradition. There's several things I usually suggest. One is to talk about it, to talk about that, I'm not comfortable with the church's stance on this particular issue. And talking with both friends, but also maybe a priest or an imam or a rabbi, or if you don't necessarily identify with a specific faith tradition, you can certainly bring in a grief counselor, a therapist, someone that you can talk about the struggles that you're having, reconciling your beliefs with where your grief journey is headed. And in that complication, I think what's so important is the fact that you've recognized that your beliefs or your faith tradition is causing the complication in your grief. We can have complicated grief. Complicated grief is a whole spectrum of experiences. There's lots of different types of grief. And sometimes even our experience with our faith and maybe the particular canon or church laws that go along with that affect how we feel about the loss that we've experienced. And I think it helps more than anything to talk about your experience. Find a support group. Find time to talk with someone of your faith tradition about some of those, because I promise you're not the only person who's experienced those challenges and the complications that your faith tradition might bring in your grief journey.
Do you think it's okay to say to someone who perhaps doesn't have a faith practice or belief, after they've lost a loved one, is it okay to say, I'm praying for you?
That's a good question, Holly. I think most people would appreciate that. They may not necessarily reach out in early grief to ask for things like that. So many times it's hard because as we see someone who's grieving, we want to help. And so we will try and say what we think is helpful. And sometimes it's not so much about telling someone you're praying for them. That may be something they don't necessarily need to hear, but they do need to sense your presence. We get asked all the time, my friend lost a son, what do I do? I just lost my mother. It's difficult, and I don't know what I'm doing things that I would normally do, but I'm trying to help other people around me with their grief too. And we find that there's not really anything you can say or do to change the situation or make that person feel better, especially in early grief. But you can be present. You can be specific about ways to help them. Maybe you notice that they need their front lawn mowed. That's something you can do. And rather than say, can I do this for you, say, hey, looks like I could probably come by and mow your lawn. You can offer prayer in a different way, too.
Right. And thinking about funerals and how they are as much for loved ones left behind as it is for the person we're remembering. So what if in the situation of a loved one did not have a faith practice, our loved one who passed away, but the family that's planning the funeral, they do, and they want to incorporate religious elements in the service. Is that okay, or should they plan more of a secular service in line with their loved one's beliefs? What do you think about that?
I think that question really speaks to having discussions about end of life before someone dies, if you're given that privilege. That's not always the case. Unfortunately, during this time of the pandemic, people have had to make these decisions without really knowing what someone's wishes or preferences would have been. I tend to lean, and others may disagree, but I tend to lean with going with what you think the person would have wanted. We don't always know that. I highly recommend having those discussions. If you can get things in writing ahead of time, make plans for what the funeral or memorial service or celebration of life looks like. Not everyone's given that luxury, but if it's at all possible, I think it's helpful. Mm-hmm. I do think for some families, having elements of their faith tradition in a service can be comforting to them, but I don't think it's necessary. I hear so many times from grievers about what-ifing the funeral decisions and did we make the right decisions. There's a lot of concern and guilt around that. And, without expressed conversation or something written down, it's hard to know. But so many times you just have to trust what feels right for that person in remembering them and hopefully make the right choice.
Those conversations are very important. And what about if the funeral is held in a secular setting? Lots of funerals are held in a place of worship, but these days that's not always the case. Is it okay to bring in your religious or faith elements into that secular setting?
I think so. As long as it's something that everyone, it's hard because funerals sometimes can be sort of like weddings where everyone's trying to make sure everyone's in agreement with what's going on, but they happen quickly. You get a year to plan for a wedding many times. You don't usually have those opportunities for a funeral unless you've had those discussions previously. And in that, if there's a way within, let's say, at the chapel at a funeral home to incorporate music or other traditions, I think anything that can bring comfort is always good. At the same time, always respecting both the wishes of the person who's died and loved ones around them as best you can. I think the funerals and memorial services certainly happen at houses of worship. Many times that's not something that's afforded in the timeline. Some faith traditions require people to be buried quickly. And so in that quick time, making decisions is so challenging for the person. That's why I always encourage people to have these discussions beforehand, if at all possible, so that you can make sure whatever that service looks like, whether it's at a funeral home or whether it's at a place of worship, that the elements that you would like are there. And the people involved in that decision-making are involved and know they're supposed to be involved. I think that's important, too. Family dynamics play such an important place and role in the process of planning a funeral, and that sometimes can make things very complicated. And so many times I encourage early grievers to just take their time with it if they can. You're grieving and trying to make really hard decisions at the same time, which it's not always an easy thing to do. Certainly isn't for most.
And do you find, Shelley, that loss can often be a test of our faith? Many people draw closer into their faith, but some people turn away from their faith after a loss.
Yeah, I think loss so many times, when it gets down to it, it reminds us of our mortality, that all of us at some time will leave this earth. And whatever faith tradition, whatever your belief happens after life, that can impact our connection with the holy, with the sacred things in our lives, with God. For some people, a loss can truly strengthen their beliefs. They can sort of double down in their faith and lean on that trust. For some, though, it can really challenge their faith and their belief systems. And many times in our workshops, we host monthly gatherings. We also have an 8-week workshop, and then weekend retreats that we offer both in person and online. And so many times in those programs, we can hear anger with someone's faith journey, anger at God. And there's really nothing wrong with being angry with God. It is human. That is a typical reaction to great loss and pain, especially for those who may have a strong faith tradition, strong faith background. It can shake that. And so many times that anger with God, it's complicated. And part of that is we are trying to find some answers into what has happened, what has caused us this pain and loss. And unfortunately, some of those answers aren't going to come easily. Our challenge many times in grief, especially in those losses that are unexpected and tragic, is the why question.
Right.
And there is never really an answer for a why question. There's nothing more accusatory than asking somebody else why they did something. And there's usually not always a good answer. And that can really, really shake someone's faith because we want answers. We're humans. We want to be able to explain what we're seeing and feeling. And our brains want us, to have those answers. And so does our heart when it comes to loss.
What role can our faith play in helping us to remember that loved one?
That's a good question. Remembering our loved ones, to me, is one of the most precious gifts that we can give ourselves. And for some faith traditions, remembering people on special holidays, and not just the traditional December holidays, but other holidays throughout the year are so important because for our loved ones who've died, 4th of July might have been a big holiday for them. That's a great time to remember those loved ones on those days that were really special to them. Birthdays, anniversaries, those things are great. But faith traditions so many times give us some framework around that. Some churches will host at the end of the year a Blue Christmas or a service of remembrance. For other faiths, they have a Days of Atonement where they can remember loved ones. They have special prayers, like in the Jewish faith, the Kaddish, which you can pray multiple times a day as a way to remember your loved one. And to remember, too, that you are a griever, that you are grieving, and it gives you an opportunity to connect with God. But remembering loved ones is so important, and that's what I love about Remembering the Life, the whole project. The website gives you so many great ideas on how to remember them, and also some really great tools to be thinking about how to remember people, because it can be more than just, you want it to be more than just an empty chair at the table, because they're not there. But there's concrete ways we can remember our loved ones. Some houses of worship will have a columbarium where you can make a memorial. Some folks will, take hopefully their gifts and maybe start a scholarship. There's so many ways to remember people, and our faith can help kind of guide us in that decision making.
Who are you remembering today, Shelley?
Thank you. Actually, this time of year, I am remembering my grandfather and my great-aunt Sylvia. The two of them had November birthdays, and though that's a couple of weeks away, I always keep them in mind just because it sort of reminds me of kind of the beginning of the holidays to think about them. And my Aunt Sylvia was an amazing woman. She was very funny, wickedly funny. And anytime I hear a really good joke, I think of her, because she loved to tease, and she loved to tell good jokes. So
that's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me today, Shelley.
Absolutely.
Your website is faithandgrief.org. And to learn more about moving forward in your grief, visit rememberingalife.com.